The gunshot that killed her father still echoed in Teresa Logan's ears 3 weeks after they buried him in the hard Wyoming soil. And now, she stood outside the general store in Jordan Valley, Oregon, with exactly $43 to her name and nowhere left to go. She had traveled alone on the stagecoach from Cheyenne, enduring every jostle and bump across hundreds of miles, her grief sitting heavy in her chest like a stone she could not swallow. The year was 1878, and the world felt impossibly vast and threatening without the only family she had ever known. Teresa adjusted the worn shawl around her shoulders and studied the dusty main street of this frontier town, where her father had once told her his old friend Samuel worked as a blacksmith. She had come here with the desperate hope that Samuel might remember her father fondly enough to offer her work or at least point her toward respectable employment. At 22 years old, she had spent her entire life in Cheyenne, helping her father run his small bookkeeping business, and the skills she possessed seemed laughably useless in this rough mountain town where men carried rifles as casually as pocket watches. The general store owner, a gruff man named Henderson, had informed her moments ago that Samuel had died the previous winter. The news had left her standing motionless on the wooden sidewalk, unable to form her next thought or plan her next move. She watched a wagon rumble past, its wheels kicking up dust that caught in the afternoon sunlight, and felt the full weight of her isolation settle over her like a suffocating blanket. "You look lost, miss." The voice came from her left, deep and measured, belonging to a man who spoke with the careful economy of someone unaccustomed to unnecessary conversation. Teresa turned and found herself looking up at the tallest man she had ever seen. He stood well over 6 feet, with shoulders so broad they seemed to block out the sun. His hair hung dark and thick to his collar, and his face bore the weathered bronze of someone who spent every day outdoors. He wore buckskin clothing that showed the powerful build of his arms and chest, and his hands looked strong enough to snap timber. His eyes, however, surprised her with their gentleness, a warm brown that studied her with concern rather than the leering assessment she had learned to recognize and avoid. "I am lost," she admitted, seeing no point in pretending otherwise. "I came here looking for someone who has passed away, and now I find myself without direction." The mountain man tilted his head slightly, considering her words. "You got family elsewhere?" "No, my father died 3 weeks ago. He was all I had." Something shifted in the man's expression, a softening around his eyes that suggested he understood the particular loneliness of her situation. "Name is Garrett Dalton. Folks around here call me Dalton. I trap and hunt in the mountains, bring furs and meat down to trade. You looking for work?" "Yes, though I confess I do not know what work I could possibly do here. I kept books for my father. I can read and write and manage accounts, but those skills seem worthless in a place like this." Garrett rubbed his jaw thoughtfully, his calloused hand rasping against several days' worth of beard. "Henderson mentioned this morning. He needs someone to manage his inventory and keep his records straight. He cannot read worth a damn and his counts are always wrong. He loses money every month because he does not know what he actually has in stock." Teresa glanced back at the general store, hope fluttering cautiously in her chest. "He did not mention that to me." "Because you are a woman alone, and Henderson is careful about who he trusts. But if I vouch for you, he will listen. I do more trade with him than anyone else in 50 miles. "Why would you vouch for me? You do not know anything about me." Garrett met her eyes steadily. "I know you traveled alone from Cheyenne, which takes courage. I know you speak plain and do not put on airs, and I know what it is to be alone in the world without family. Sometimes people need help, and if I can provide it, I do." The simple decency of his words made Teresa's throat tighten with unexpected emotion. She had been braced for suspicion and difficulty, had steeled herself for rejection and struggle, and this stranger's kindness caught her completely unprepared. She blinked rapidly, refusing to let tears fall in the middle of the street. "I would be very grateful for your help, Mr. Dalton." "Just Dalton." He gestured toward the store. "Come on, let us talk to Henderson." 10 minutes later, Teresa had secured a position managing inventory and accounts for the general store, with living quarters in a small room at the back of the building. The pay was modest but fair, and Henderson, once Garrett vouched for her competence and character, proved willing enough to give her a chance. When the arrangement was settled and Henderson returned to helping another customer, Teresa found Garrett still waiting by the door. Thank you," she said, meaning it with every fiber of her being. "I truly do not know what I would have done without your intervention." Garrett shrugged but seemed pleased. "You will do fine here. Henderson is honest. If rough around the edges, the work is straightforward." He paused, then added, "If you need anything, my cabin is about 8 miles northeast, up in the foothills. Anyone in town can point you toward the trail." 8 miles, Teresa repeated, trying to imagine the distance. She had never traveled anywhere on foot beyond the streets of Cheyenne, had never ridden a horse or driven a wagon or navigated wilderness. Her entire world had existed within a few square blocks of civilization. "Not far on horseback," Garrett said. "Do you ride?" "No, I've never had occasion to learn." Something like surprise crossed his face, quickly replaced by thoughtful consideration. "Well, if you ever want to see the country properly, I would be glad to show you. There are places in these mountains that will take your breath away." Teresa smiled despite herself. "I have never ridden in a wagon either, except for the stagecoach that brought me here. I am woefully unprepared for life in this territory." "The territory will teach you what you need to know." Garrett touched the brim of his hat in farewell. "Welcome to Jordan Valley, Miss Logan." "Teresa, please." He nodded once and then he was gone, moving down the sidewalk with the easy, purposeful stride of a man completely comfortable in his own skin. Teresa watched him go, feeling oddly bereft at his departure, as though she had just lost the only safe anchor in a churning sea. The following weeks established a rhythm that Teresa found both exhausting and deeply satisfying. She threw herself into organizing Henderson's chaotic inventory, creating detailed ledgers that tracked every item in the store from penny nails to bolts of fabric. She discovered that Henderson had been losing nearly 15% of his potential profit to simple disorganization and inability to reorder supplies before they ran out. Within 2 weeks, she had implemented a system that allowed him to see at a glance what needed replenishing and what was selling well. Henderson, initially skeptical of her abilities despite Garrett's endorsement, became increasingly impressed with her work. He raised her pay after the first month and began consulting her on purchasing decisions. Teresa found herself learning the peculiar economy of a frontier town, understanding which goods were essential and which were luxuries that only sold sporadically. She also learned the rhythms of Jordan Valley itself. The town consisted of perhaps 300 souls, with another few hundred scattered in ranches and homesteads throughout the surrounding valleys. Men outnumbered women significantly, and Teresa quickly understood that her presence as a young, unmarried woman would attract attention whether she wanted it or not. She kept herself reserved and professional, friendly but not encouraging, and most of the men learned to respect her boundaries. Garrett came to town every week or two to trade furs and meat, and Teresa found herself watching for his arrival with an eagerness she did not quite want to examine. He always stopped at the general store, conducting his business with Henderson, before spending a few minutes talking with Teresa about nothing in particular. He asked how she was settling in, whether she needed anything, if Henderson was treating her fairly. His concern felt genuine rather than intrusive, protective rather than possessive, and Teresa discovered she valued his friendship more than she would have thought possible. "You should come up to my cabin sometime," Garrett said one afternoon in late September, leaning against the counter while Teresa sorted through a new shipment of canned goods. "The aspen are turning gold right now. The whole mountainside looks like it is on fire with color." Teresa paused in her work, considering the invitation. "I would like that, but I do not know how I would get there. I still have not learned to ride, and walking 8 miles seems rather daunting. I would bring a wagon and drive you. We could make a day of it. There's a valley about 10 miles north of my place where you can see clear across 3 mountain ranges. The view is something everyone should see at least once." The offer tempted her more than was probably wise. She had been in Jordan Valley for nearly 2 months and had not ventured beyond the town limits. Her world had contracted to the general store, her small room, and occasional walks down the main street. The idea of seeing the mountains properly, of experiencing the landscape that defined this territory, pulled at something deep inside her. "When would we go?" she asked. "Sunday, if the weather holds. I can pick you up early, have you back before dark." "All right," Teresa heard herself say. "Yes, I would like that very much." Garrett's face broke into a genuine smile, and Teresa felt her heart perform a small, unexpected flip in her chest. When had this man become so important to her? When had she started cataloging the details of his appearance, noticing the way his hair curled slightly at his collar when it needed cutting, or how his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled? Sunday arrived clear and cold, with frost sparkling on the ground and the sky a brilliant, endless blue. Teresa dressed in her warmest clothing and waited outside the general store just after dawn. She heard the wagon before she saw it, the creak of wheels and the steady clopping of horse hooves, and then Garrett appeared, driving a sturdy wagon pulled by two large draft horses. He pulled up beside her and jumped down with athletic ease. "Morning, Teresa. You ready to see the country?" "I think so," she said, eyeing the wagon seat with some trepidation. She had never climbed into a wagon before, had no idea how to manage her skirts and the high wheel and the awkward step up all at once. Garrett seemed to understand her hesitation without her having to voice it. "Here," he said, offering his hand. "Step on the hub there, and I will help you up." His hand engulfed hers, strong and warm even through her glove. Teresa placed her foot where he indicated and let him guide her up onto the seat. His strength made the climb effortless, and within seconds she was settled on the bench, arranging her skirts while Garrett walked around to the other side and swung up beside her. "Comfortable?" he asked. "Yes," she said, though in truth she felt nervous and exhilarated in equal measure. The wagon seat was narrower than she had expected, putting Garrett close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his large frame. He clicked to the horses and they started forward, the wagon rocking gently beneath them. Teresa gripped the edge of the seat as they left the town behind and headed north along a rough trail that climbed steadily into the foothills. The motion of the wagon felt foreign and slightly alarming at first, every bump and rock transmitting through the wheels to jostle her on the hard seat. But gradually she relaxed and began to take in her surroundings. The landscape was more beautiful than she had imagined. Rolling hills covered in sagebrush and grass rose toward mountains that thrust dramatically against the sky. Stands of aspen glowed golden in the morning light, just as Garrett had promised, their leaves shimmering in the breeze. The air smelled clean and sharp, carrying hints of pine and earth and the dusty sweetness of dried grass. "It is incredible," Teresa breathed, twisting in her seat to take it all in. "I had no idea it would be like this." Garrett looked pleased. "This is nothing yet. Wait until we get higher." They drove for over an hour, climbing steadily into rougher country. Garrett pointed out landmarks as they went, naming distant peaks and explaining the geography with the easy knowledge of someone who had traveled every inch of this territory on foot. He showed her where a creek ran through a narrow canyon, where elk liked to gather in the meadows during early morning, where he had built a small shelter for use during his longer hunting trips. "You spend a lot of time alone out here," Teresa observed. "I do. I prefer it that way, mostly. People make things complicated." "Do I make things complicated?" she asked, surprising herself with her boldness. Garrett turned to look at her, his expression thoughtful. "No, you make things clearer somehow. I do not entirely understand it myself." The words hung between them, weighted with meaning that Teresa did not quite know how to interpret. She felt her cheeks warming despite the cool air and looked away, pretending great interest in a hawk circling overhead. They reached Garrett's cabin around mid-morning. It was larger than Teresa had expected, built of solid logs with a stone chimney and a covered porch. The location was stunning, situated on a bench of land that overlooked a broad valley with mountains rising on three sides. A small stream ran nearby, and a lean-to stable housed Garrett's two horses and a milk cow. "It is beautiful," Teresa said as Garrett helped her down from the wagon. "You built this yourself?" "Mostly. Had some help with the heavy timbers, but yes, took me 2 summers to finish it properly." He showed her around the property, pointing out his smokehouse and the root cellar where he stored vegetables and preserved foods for winter. The cabin interior was surprisingly neat and well organized, with handmade furniture that showed considerable skill in woodworking. Books lined one shelf, which surprised Teresa until she remembered he would have long, isolated winters with little to do but read. "You have good taste in literature," she said, running her fingers along the spines. She recognized several titles she loved. "My mother taught me to read. She insisted I should have an education even if I ended up living in the mountains. When I go to Boise once or twice a year, I always buy more books." Teresa turned to find him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. The cabin suddenly felt very small and intimate, and she was acutely aware that they were utterly alone, miles from anyone else. The realization should have frightened her, but instead she felt only a strange, thrilling awareness of his presence. "Should we continue to the valley you mentioned?" she asked, her voice coming out quieter than she intended. Garrett nodded, seeming to shake himself from whatever thoughts had been occupying him. "Yes. It is another hour's drive, but worth every minute." They set out again, following a trail that was little more than 2 faint ruts through the grass. The terrain grew rougher, and several times Teresa had to grip the seat tightly as the wagon lurched over rocks or through deep ruts. Garrett drove with easy competence, his hands steady on the reins, his attention divided between the trail and the landscape around them. "Tell me about your father," he said after a while. "What was he like?" The question caught Teresa off guard. She had been carefully not thinking about her father, pushing her grief down where it could not overwhelm her. But something about the moment, the isolation and the quiet intimacy of sharing the wagon seat, made her want to talk. He was kind," she said slowly. "Gentle. He loved books and numbers and order. After my mother died when I was 8, he raised me by himself. He never remarried, never even looked at another woman as far as I could tell. He taught me everything he knew about keeping accounts and running a business. I think he hoped I would take over from him when he got old." "How did he die?" "He was shot by a man who owed him money. It was stupid and senseless. The man was drunk and angry about being pressed for payment, and he shot my father in the street in broad daylight. They hanged him 3 days later, but that did not bring my father back." Garrett was quiet for a moment, then said, "I'm sorry. That's a hard way to lose someone." "How did you lose your family?" Teresa asked, realizing she had been curious about his history since their first meeting. "My parents died of cholera when I was 19. I had a younger sister, but she died too. I was the only one who survived, and I never understood why. After that, I could not stay in the settlement where we had lived. Too many ghosts. So I came west and started trapping. That was 8 years ago. You have been alone all that time?" "More or less. I go to town when I need to, trade my furs, buy supplies, but mostly I'm up here. I like the solitude. Or I did, anyway." He glanced at her sideways. "Lately I find myself wanting company more than usual." Teresa's heart was beating too fast, and she knew she should say something light and deflecting, should keep their conversation safely in the territory of friendship rather than letting it drift toward something more dangerous. But she found she did not want to deflect. She wanted to know what he meant, wanted to understand if the pull she felt toward him was mutual. "What changed?" she asked quietly. "I met a woman who had never ridden in a wagon," Garrett said, his voice low and serious. "And I found I wanted to show her everything I had learned to love about this country. I wanted to share it with her, see it new through her eyes." Before Teresa could respond, they crested a rise and the valley opened before them. She gasped, all words fleeing her mind in the face of what she was seeing. The valley stretched vast and green below them, rimmed by mountains that rose in successive ranges, each one hazier than the last, creating layers of blue and purple and gray that extended to the horizon. The sky arched enormous overhead, and the light seemed to come from everywhere at once, illuminating the landscape with crystalline clarity. "Oh," Teresa whispered. "Oh, Garrett, it is magnificent." He pulled the horses to a stop and set the brake, and they sat in silence, just looking. Teresa felt tears prickling her eyes, though she could not have said whether they came from the beauty before her, or the emotion of the moment, or the cumulative weight of everything that had happened in the past months. Probably all three, tangled together into something too complex to name. "Thank you for bringing me here," she said when she could trust her voice. "I have never seen anything like this. I did not know places like this existed." "There is more," Garrett said. "Mountains that touch the clouds, canyons so deep you cannot see the bottom, rivers that run wild through gorges. This country is full of wonders if you know where to look." "I want to see all of it," Teresa said impulsively. "I want to know this land the way you do." Garrett turned to face her fully, his brown eyes searching hers. "I would like to show you, if you would let me." "Yes," Teresa said, though she understood they were agreeing to something more than geography lessons. I would like that very much. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers were rough and warm, and Teresa shivered at the contact. She had never been touched with such gentleness, such careful intention. "You are not afraid of me," he said, and it sounded like a question and a statement both. "No, should I be? Some women are. I am large and rough, and I live like an animal half the time. I am not civilized the way a town man is." Teresa reached up and covered his hand with hers where it still rested against her cheek. "You are the kindest man I have ever met. You saw a stranger in distress and helped her without asking anything in return. You have been nothing but respectful and protective. Why would I fear you?" Something fierce and tender crossed his face, and then he was leaning toward her, giving her every opportunity to move away. Teresa did not move away. She closed the distance between them and kissed him, tentative and uncertain, her first kiss given freely, rather than stolen by some presumptuous suitor. Garrett made a low sound and cupped her face with both hands, deepening the kiss with a hunger that should have alarmed her, but instead sent heat racing through her entire body. His mouth was warm and sure, and kissing him felt like the most natural thing in the world, like something she had been waiting her whole life to do. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Garrett rested his forehead against hers. "Teresa Logan, I did not plan for this, did not expect it, but I am falling for you hard and fast, and I need you to know that before this goes any further." "I am falling too," Teresa admitted, her voice shaking slightly. "I have been trying not to, trying to be sensible, but I think about you constantly. I watch for you when you come to town. I treasure every conversation we have, no matter how brief." "Then we are agreed," Garrett said, pulling back just enough to look into her eyes. "This is not just friendship." "No," Teresa agreed. "It is not just friendship." They stayed in the valley for another hour, sitting close together on the wagon seat, talking about everything and nothing. Garrett told her about his life in the mountains, the rhythms of the seasons, the animals he hunted, and the furs he trapped. Teresa talked about growing up in Cheyenne, about learning to love books and numbers, about her quiet dreams that had never extended beyond helping her father in his business. "What do you dream of now?" Garrett asked. Teresa looked out across the valley, considering. "I do not know exactly. I'm still figuring out who I am without my father, what I want from life. But I know I do not want to spend my whole existence behind a counter, adding up sums. I want to see things, experience things. I want to understand this country and learn to be at home in it." "You could do that," Garrett said. "I could teach you to ride, to shoot if you wanted. You could learn to navigate by landmarks, to understand weather signs, to recognize animal tracks. It is not as hard as it seems once you stop being afraid." "I would like to learn all of that," Teresa said, "though perhaps not all at once." Garrett smiled and stood, offering his hand to help her up. "We should start back. I want to get you home before dark like I promised Henderson." The drive back took on a different quality, charged with new awareness and possibility. They held hands when the trail was smooth enough that Garrett only needed one hand on the reins. They stopped at his cabin again so he could put the horses away and pack up some smoked venison for Teresa to take back to town. While he worked in the stable, Teresa stood on the porch and looked out at the view, imagining what it would be like to live in such a place, to wake up every morning to such beauty. Dangerous thoughts, she told herself. They had only just acknowledged their feelings. It was far too soon to be imagining a future together. But her heart seemed not to care about sensible timelines, and it insisted on painting vivid pictures of what life with Garrett Dalton might look like. They reached Jordan Valley just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that rivaled the morning's display. Garrett pulled up behind the general store and helped Teresa down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist. "Thank you for today," Teresa said, reluctant to let the moment end. "It was perfect." "The first of many, I hope," Garrett replied. He kissed her once more, quick and sweet, then stepped back. "I will be back in town in a few days. Will you have dinner with me? The hotel restaurant is decent enough." "I would love that." She watched him drive away, the wagon disappearing into the growing darkness, and hugged herself against the cold. Everything had changed in the span of a single day, her careful, ordered world upended by feelings she had never expected to experience. She was frightened and exhilarated and happier than she had been since her father died. The next months unfolded in a pattern that satisfied something deep in Teresa's soul. She worked at the general store during the week, managing Henderson's inventory with increasing skill and confidence. On Sundays, when the store was closed, Garrett would come for her and they would spend the day exploring the surrounding country. He brought her on increasingly ambitious excursions, teaching her about the land with patient thoroughness. True to his word, he taught her to ride. He brought a gentle mare named Stella to town one October morning and spent hours teaching Teresa the basics of horsemanship. She proved an adequate, if not graceful, rider, managing to stay mounted even when Stella spooked at a rabbit. Garrett stayed close throughout the lesson, ready to catch her if she fell, his protectiveness both comforting and slightly amusing. "I am not made of glass," Teresa protested after he rushed to grab Stella's bridle when the mare sidestepped a rock. "I know that," Garrett said, "but if you got hurt, I would never forgive myself. You cannot protect me from every potential harm. I can try." The possessive intensity in his voice should have bothered her, but instead it sent a thrill through her entire body. She liked being important to him, liked mattering this much to someone. After months of feeling adrift and alone, Garrett's devotion anchored her in the world again. By November, she could ride well enough that they ventured farther from town, sometimes camping overnight in the mountains. Garrett was scrupulously proper about these arrangements, always ensuring they had separate sleeping areas and never pushing for more physical intimacy than Teresa was ready to give. They kissed often, long, passionate embraces that left them both breathing hard and wanting more. But Garrett always pulled back before things went too far. "I want to do this right," he said, one cold night as they sat by the campfire, wrapped in separate blankets despite both wishing they could share warmth more directly. "I want to marry you properly, Teresa. I want everyone to know you are mine and I am yours. I do not want to dishonor you by acting like we do not have to follow the rules everyone else does." "You want to marry me?" Teresa asked, her heart leaping. "Of course I do. Did you think I was doing all this for casual amusement? I've been in love with you since about the second week we knew each other. I'm just waiting for the right time to ask officially." "This seems like a good time," Teresa pointed out, smiling. Garrett laughed and shook his head. "No, when I ask you to marry me, it will be done right. I will have a ring, and you will be somewhere beautiful, and I will say all the things I have been thinking for months. You deserve a proper proposal, Teresa Logan." "I do not care about proper," Teresa said. "I care about you." "Then trust me to do this my way," Garrett said gently. "It will not be long, I promise." Winter arrived in earnest in December, bringing snow that blanketed the mountains and turned Jordan Valley into a frosted wonderland. Garrett's visits to town became less frequent as the trails grew difficult to navigate, and Teresa found herself missing him with an intensity that bordered on physical pain. She had not realized how much of her happiness had become tied to his presence until that presence was reduced to once every 2 or 3 weeks. He came to town 2 weeks before Christmas, driving through a light snowfall to reach her. Teresa saw him coming from the window of the general store and rushed outside without bothering to put on her coat. Garrett jumped from his horse and caught her up in his arms, lifting her clear off the ground as he kissed her. "I missed you," he said against her mouth. "Every day, every minute." "I missed you too," Teresa said, clinging to him. "It has been too long." "I know. The weather has been terrible. But I have something for you." He set her down and reached into his saddlebag, pulling out a small wooden box that he had clearly made himself. "Open it." Teresa opened the box with shaking hands and found a ring inside, silver with a small but perfect sapphire set in the center. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "Teresa Logan," Garrett said, taking the ring from the box and dropping to one knee right there in the snowy street, heedless of the cold or the few passers-by who stopped to watch. "I love you more than I thought it possible to love anyone. You have brought light and joy into a life that had become nothing but routine survival. I want to wake up next to you every morning for the rest of my life. I want to show you every beautiful place I've ever found and discover new ones together. I want to build a life with you, have children with you, grow old with you. Will you marry me?" Teresa was crying, tears streaming down her face as she nodded frantically. "Yes, yes, of course, yes." Garrett surged to his feet and slipped the ring onto her finger, then kissed her with such fierce joy that Teresa felt it all the way to her toes. Around them, the small crowd that had gathered applauded, and someone let out a whoop of celebration. "How did you get a ring?" Teresa asked, when she could speak again. "You have been trapped in the mountains for weeks." "I bought it 2 months ago in Boise," Garrett admitted. "I've been carrying it around waiting for the right moment, and then the weather turned bad and I could not get to you. I was going insane." 2 months, Teresa marveled. "You have been planning this for 2 months." "Longer than that, really. I knew I wanted to marry you by August. I just had to work up the courage to actually do it. You trap mountain lions and fight off wolves, but you were nervous to propose to me?" "Terrified," Garrett confirmed. "You could have said no." "Never," Teresa said, kissing him again. "There was never any chance of me saying no." They were married in late January during a brief break in the winter storms. The ceremony took place in the small church in Jordan Valley, with half the town in attendance despite the cold. Teresa wore a simple blue dress that she had sewn herself, and Garrett wore clean buckskins and a new shirt that made his broad shoulders look impossibly wide. He had trimmed his hair and beard for the occasion, though Teresa had made him promise not to cut them too short. Henderson gave Teresa away, gruff and emotional, and a traveling preacher who happened to be in town performed the ceremony. When Garrett kissed his bride, the church erupted in cheers, loud enough to rattle the windows. They spent their wedding night at the hotel, the only concession to luxury Garrett could offer in the middle of winter. Teresa had been nervous about the physical intimacy of marriage, but Garrett proved as patient and tender as he had been in every other aspect of their relationship. He took his time, made sure she felt safe and cherished, and turned what could have been awkward or frightening into something beautiful and profound. "I love you," Teresa whispered afterward, curled against his chest with his arms wrapped around her. "I did not know I could be this happy." "I love you too," Garrett said, kissing the top of her head. "You are mine now, Teresa Dalton, and I am yours. Nothing will ever change that." They moved to Garrett's cabin in early February, as soon as the weather allowed. Teresa said goodbye to Henderson in the general store, though she promised to come back in the spring and help him train a replacement. The wagon ride to her new home felt entirely different from that first journey months ago. Teresa no longer felt frightened or uncertain. She felt excited and ready, eager to begin this new chapter of her life. Living in the mountains proved harder than Teresa had anticipated. The cabin was comfortable but isolated, and the work of maintaining a household without any of the conveniences of town required skills she had to learn through trial and error. She learned to cook over the fireplace, to haul water from the stream, to preserve meat and vegetables, and stretch supplies through the long winter. Garrett helped her with everything, patient and encouraging even when she made mistakes. But the hardships were balanced by profound joys. Teresa woke every morning to views that took her breath away, the mountains rising stark and beautiful against the sky. She learned to appreciate the silence, the way sound carried in the thin air, the particular quality of light at different times of day. She learned the animals that lived around them, recognizing the tracks of deer and elk and the occasional mountain lion. She learned the rhythm of Garrett's work, understanding when he needed to check his trap lines and when he needed to hunt, learning to keep the home fires burning while he was gone. And she learned the depth of Garrett's love for her. He proved endlessly considerate, always thinking of her comfort and happiness. He brought her wildflowers in the spring, picking them carefully on his way home from checking traps. He built her a bookshelf and made the long trip to Boise specifically to buy her new books. He held her through the lonely nights when the wolves howled close to the cabin and the wind screamed down from the peaks. By summer, Teresa felt like she had lived in the mountains her entire life. She could ride Stella confidently through rough terrain, could navigate by landmarks, could even shoot well enough to bring down small game when necessary. Garrett praised her progress constantly, clearly proud of how well she had adapted to this challenging life. "You are stronger than you know," he told her one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. "When I first saw you in Jordan Valley, you looked lost and fragile. Now look at you. You could survive out here on your own if you had to." "I would rather not have to," Teresa said, leaning against him. "I prefer surviving with you." "That's the plan," Garrett agreed, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "Together until we are both too old to climb these mountains anymore." In August, Teresa realized she was pregnant. The knowledge filled her with equal parts joy and terror. She had helped her father keep books, had managed a general store, had learned to survive in the wilderness, but she knew nothing about babies or childbirth. The nearest doctor was in Jordan Valley, 20 miles away over rough terrain. Garrett took the news with fierce protectiveness that would have been suffocating if it had not been so clearly motivated by love. He immediately began making plans to move them back to Jordan Valley for the birth, unwilling to risk Teresa or the baby by being too far from medical help. "We do not have to move," Teresa protested. "Women have babies in the wilderness all the time." "Not my wife," Garrett said firmly. "Not with my child. I'm not taking any chances. We will rent a house in town for a few months, make sure you and the baby are safe and healthy. After that, we can come back to the cabin if you want." They moved back to Jordan Valley in October, renting a small house on the edge of town. The change was disorienting for Teresa, who had grown accustomed to the solitude and space of the mountains. The town felt cramped and noisy, full of people and activity that seemed intrusive after months of quiet. But she understood Garrett's reasoning and appreciated his concern, even if she thought it slightly excessive. Their son was born in late February of 1880, arriving after a long and difficult labor that left Teresa exhausted but triumphant. Garrett had paced outside the house for hours, unable to sit still, clearly terrified despite his efforts to appear calm. When the midwife finally let him in to meet his son, his face transformed with such pure joy that Teresa started crying all over again. "He is perfect," Garrett whispered, carefully taking the tiny bundle and cradling him against his massive chest. The contrast between his size and the baby's fragility was almost comical. "He is absolutely perfect, Teresa." "What should we name him?" Teresa asked. They had discussed names for months without reaching agreement. But looking at her son, Teresa suddenly knew exactly what she wanted to call him. "Samuel," she said. "After your father's friend who I came to Jordan Valley looking for. If not for Samuel, even though he had passed, I never would have met you." Garrett's eyes grew bright with emotion. "Samuel Dalton. I like that. It is a good, strong name." Little Samuel proved to be a demanding baby, colicky and fussy, keeping them both awake for long stretches of the night. Teresa was overwhelmed by the responsibility of caring for such a tiny, helpless creature, terrified she would make some fatal mistake. Garrett helped as much as he could, walking the floor with his son, singing surprisingly sweet lullabies in his deep voice, changing nappies with a carefulness that would have been funny if Teresa had not been too tired to appreciate the humor. "You are a good father," Teresa told him one night as she watched him soothe Samuel back to sleep. "Mom, I'm trying," Garrett said. "I never thought I would have this. A family. After my parents and sister died, I assumed I would always be alone. You and Samuel are gifts I never expected to receive." They stayed in Jordan Valley until Samuel was 3 months old and the spring weather had stabilized. Then, despite the protests of several town women who thought Teresa was insane to take a baby into the wilderness, they returned to the cabin in the mountains. Garrett had spent several weeks during Teresa's pregnancy improving the cabin, adding a separate bedroom and reinforcing the walls and roof. He had also built a beautiful cradle that sat next to their bed, carved with intricate patterns of mountains and trees. The first year of Samuel's life passed in a blur of sleepless nights and endless work. Teresa discovered that caring for a baby while maintaining a household in the wilderness required reserves of energy she had not known she possessed. But she also discovered depths of love she had never imagined, looking at her son and feeling her heart expand until it seemed too large for her chest. Garrett proved to be an excellent father, involved and attentive in ways that surprised the few people who knew them. He built Samuel toys, carved animals and wagons that the baby could play with as he grew. He took his son everywhere with him around the property, carrying Samuel in a sling against his chest while he chopped wood or tended the animals. He sang to him constantly, made up elaborate stories to tell him, treated him with a gentleness that contrasted beautifully with his rough exterior. By the time Samuel was 2, Teresa was pregnant again. This second pregnancy felt easier somehow, perhaps because she knew what to expect, perhaps because Samuel kept her too busy to worry as much. They returned to Jordan Valley for the birth, and in November of 1882, Teresa delivered a healthy baby girl they named Grace. Grace proved to be a much easier baby than Samuel had been, sleeping through the night early and smiling at everyone who looked at her. Samuel was fascinated by his little sister, constantly wanting to hold her and show her his toys. Garrett seemed to melt completely at the sight of his daughter, this tiny girl who had him wrapped around her finger from the moment she was born. "Two children," Garrett said wonderingly one evening as he sat with Grace asleep on his chest while Samuel played at his feet. "I am the richest man alive." "We are very lucky," Teresa agreed, though privately she thought luck had little to do with it. What they had built together had come from hard work and commitment and love that deepened with every passing year. The years that followed established a rhythm that satisfied all of them. They spent most of the year at the cabin, with trips to Jordan Valley every few months for supplies and socializing. Teresa taught both children to read and write, determined they would have the education she valued even if they lived far from any school. Garrett taught them about the mountains, about tracking and hunting and surviving in the wilderness. Samuel proved naturally adept at outdoor skills, following his father everywhere and absorbing knowledge like a sponge. Grace was more interested in books and drawing, often sitting with Teresa while her mother worked through household tasks. In the summer of 1885, when Samuel was 5 and Grace was 3, Garrett decided it was time to show the children the valley that had been the site of his proposal to Teresa. They made a family expedition of it, packing the wagon with supplies for camping overnight and setting out early on a perfect June morning. The children were wildly excited, bouncing in the wagon and pointing at everything they saw. Teresa sat next to Garrett on the bench seat, Grace in her lap and Samuel pressed against his father's side, chattering non-stop about the animals he hoped to see. Garrett drove with one hand, his other arm around his son, looking more content than Teresa had ever seen him. When they reached the valley overlook, both children fell silent, struck speechless by the vast beauty spread before them. Samuel scrambled down from the wagon and walked to the edge, staring out at the layers of mountains with wide eyes. "Papa," he said finally, "this is the most beautiful place in the world." "It is special," Garrett agreed. "This is where I asked your mother to marry me. I wanted you and your sister to see it too, to understand how big and beautiful the world is." Grace climbed down from Teresa's lap and went to stand next to her brother, slipping her small hand into his. "Can we come back?" she asked. "I want to see this again." "We will come back every year," Garrett promised. "This will be our family place." They camped there that night, sleeping under the stars with a fire crackling nearby. Garrett told the children stories about the mountains, about the native peoples who had lived in these valleys long before white settlers arrived, about the animals and birds and the changing seasons. Teresa listened with half an ear, most of her attention focused on the profound contentment of the moment. Her husband, her children, the wilderness she had learned to love, all combining into a peace so complete it brought tears to her eyes. "What are you thinking?" Garrett asked later, after the children had fallen asleep and they sat together by the dying fire. "I am thinking about how lost I was when I first came to Jordan Valley, how frightened and alone I felt, and now look at us, look at what we have built together." "You were never lost," Garrett said, pulling her close. "You were just waiting in the wrong place. You had to come here to find where you belonged." "With you," Teresa said. "With me," Garrett agreed. "Always." The years continued to pass, marked by the changing seasons and the growth of their children. Samuel grew tall and strong like his father, with the same quiet competence and love of the mountains. Grace grew into a thoughtful, creative girl who filled the cabin with drawings and stories, forever asking questions about everything she saw. They added a third child in 1887, another boy they named Thomas, and then a final daughter, Margaret, in 1890. 4 children transformed the cabin from a quiet refuge into a place of constant noise and activity. Garrett added more rooms, expanding the structure until it was nearly twice its original size. Teresa managed the chaos with increasing skill, teaching her children to read and write and cipher, to be kind to each other and respectful of the natural world around them. She also taught them about their heritage, telling them stories of their grandfather, who had died in Wyoming, making sure they understood where they came from even as they built their lives in these mountains. Garrett proved to be as devoted to all 4 children as he had been to the first 2. He carved toys for each of them, built them swings, and taught them to ride, to shoot, to survive in the wilderness. He also taught them gentleness and respect, demonstrating through his actions that strength and kindness were not opposites, but complementary virtues. Teresa watched him with their children and fell more deeply in love with him every year, this powerful man who had never once used his strength for anything but protection and provision. By 1895, Samuel was 15 and already nearly as tall as his father, spending most of his time helping with the trap lines and hunting. Grace was 13, her nose usually buried in a book when she was not helping Teresa with household chores or looking after her younger siblings. Thomas was 8, rambunctious and curious, forever getting into minor trouble. Margaret was 5, the baby of the family and spoiled by everyone, though she had inherited enough of her father's stubbornness to keep from being completely ruined by the attention. That summer, Garrett decided it was time to make another family trip to the valley overlook, this time including all 4 children. They packed the wagon and several horses, turning the journey into a proper camping expedition. The trip took longer with 4 children than it had with 2, but Teresa did not mind. She watched Samuel help his father drive the wagon, watched Grace keep Thomas and Margaret entertained with stories, and felt profound gratitude for the family they had created. The valley was as beautiful as ever, perhaps more so because she was sharing it with all the people she loved most in the world. The children explored enthusiastically while Garrett set up camp and Teresa prepared dinner. That evening, they all sat around the fire while Garrett told stories, and the children asked endless questions about the land and the sky and everything they could see. "Tell us about when you met Mama," Margaret demanded, snuggling against Teresa's side. It was a story the children never tired of hearing, each of them having their favorite parts. Teresa glanced at Garrett and smiled, letting him take the lead. "Well," Garrett began, settling back with Thomas in his lap and his 3 other children arranged around him. "Your mother came to Jordan Valley on the stagecoach from Wyoming, looking lost and scared and very alone. She had never ridden in a wagon, had never been out of the city, had never seen mountains like these. And when I saw her standing there looking so brave even though she was clearly terrified, I knew I had to help her." "Because you loved her immediately," Grace said with the romantic certainty of a 13-year-old girl. "Because she needed help," Garrett corrected gently. "But yes, I did fall in love with her very quickly. She was smart and brave and kind, and she did not look at me like I was some wild mountain man to be afraid of. She looked at me like I was a person worth knowing." "And then Papa helped Mama get a job," Samuel continued, knowing the story by heart, "and then he brought her up here to see the valley." That is right," Teresa said, taking over the narrative. "Your father drove me in his wagon, and I had never experienced anything like it. The mountains were so beautiful, and your father was so patient, teaching me about everything we saw. And when we got here, to this exact spot, I looked out at the view and understood for the first time that I had found my home." "And then Papa kissed you," Margaret said with great satisfaction. "He did," Teresa confirmed, meeting Garrett's eyes across the fire and seeing the same love there that she had seen 17 years ago. "And then he told me he was falling in love with me, and I told him I was falling in love too." "And then you got married and had us," Thomas said, always eager to get to the part of the story where he existed. "Exactly," Garrett said, ruffling his son's hair. "And now here we all are, together in the most beautiful place in the world, and I could not be happier about how everything turned out." The children eventually fell asleep, sprawled in various positions around the fire. Teresa and Garrett sat up longer, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky and listening to the night sounds of the wilderness. "Do you ever regret it?" Garrett asked quietly. "Giving up town life, living out here where everything is hard work and isolation?" "Never," Teresa said firmly, "not once. This life is harder than what I knew before, but it is also richer and more real. I have you and our children and this incredible land. I have everything I could possibly want." "I love you," Garrett said, pulling her against his side. "I've loved you since the day I met you, and I will love you until the day I die." "I love you too," Teresa said, resting her head on his shoulder. "Thank you for driving me miles just to show me the valley views. Thank you for showing me everything beautiful about this country. Thank you for giving me a life I never knew I wanted but could not imagine living without." They sat in comfortable silence for a while longer, 2 people who had found each other against all odds and built something lasting and true. Around them, their children slept peacefully, safe and warm and loved beyond measure. Above them, the stars wheeled across the infinite sky, and the mountains stood eternal and unchanging, witnesses to all the small, important moments that made up a human life. The years continued their steady march forward. Samuel grew into a man who was the image of his father, strong and quiet and deeply good. He eventually met a girl from Jordan Valley and married her, bringing her back to the mountains to build a cabin near his parents' place. Grace surprised everyone by moving to Boise to attend school, determined to become a teacher. She succeeded, eventually returning to Jordan Valley to teach at the town school, where she met and married the new doctor. Thomas became a rancher, buying land in the valley below and raising cattle with the same dedication his father had brought to trapping. Margaret, the baby, turned out to have her mother's head for numbers and ended up managing a bank in Boise, though she came home to visit often. Garrett and Teresa watched their children grow and leave and build their own lives with bittersweet pride. The cabin felt empty with just the two of them, but also peaceful in a way it had not been for years. They settled into a new rhythm, one focused more on each other than on the demands of raising children. "We are getting old," Garrett observed one evening in 1910, watching Teresa knit by the firelight. He was 55, and though still strong and capable, he could no longer ignore the signs of age creeping up on him. His hair had gone mostly gray, his joints ached on cold mornings, and he could not trap as many miles in a day as he once had. "We are," Teresa agreed. She was 54, her own hair streaked with white, her hands showing the wear of decades of hard work. "Does it bother you?" "No," Garrett said thoughtfully. "I am grateful for it, actually. Every gray hair represents a year I got to spend with you. Every ache is a reminder of work I did to provide for our family. I will take aging over the alternative any day." "We have had a good life," Teresa said. "We have had an extraordinary life," Garrett corrected. "Better than I ever dreamed possible." In 1915, they finally admitted they were too old to spend winters alone in the cabin. They bought a small house in Jordan Valley, spending the cold months in town near their children and grandchildren, then returning to the cabin every spring to enjoy the mountains they both still loved. The compromise satisfied them both, providing the society and convenience of town when they needed it, while preserving their connection to the wilderness that had shaped their marriage. They celebrated their 45th wedding anniversary in 1924, surrounded by their 4 children, 14 grandchildren, and a handful of great-grandchildren. The celebration took place in Jordan Valley, with half the town turning out to honor the couple who had become something of a local legend. Stories about the mountain man and his city bride had been told and retold over the decades, growing more romantic with each iteration until they bore only passing resemblance to actual events. "They say you killed a grizzly bear with your bare hands to impress Grandma," one of Thomas's sons said to Garrett during the party. Garrett laughed and shook his head. "I've killed a few bears over the years, but never with my bare hands and never to impress your grandmother. The truth is much simpler and more boring. I saw a woman who needed help, and I helped her. Then I fell in love with her, and she somehow decided to love me back. That is the whole story." "It is not boring at all," Teresa said, materializing at his elbow. Even at 68, she moved with purpose and energy that belied her age. "It is a perfectly good story, exactly as it happened." "You are biased," Garrett said, putting his arm around her waist. "I am the one who lived it," Teresa countered. "I think that makes me an excellent judge of its merits." That night, lying in bed in their house in Jordan Valley, Garrett pulled Teresa close and held her tightly. "What is wrong?" she asked, sensing his mood. "Nothing is wrong. I'm just thinking about time and how fast it goes. It feels like yesterday that I saw you standing outside Henderson's store looking lost. How is it possible that was 46 years ago?" "I do not know," Teresa said, "but I'm glad for every one of those years, even the hard ones, especially the hard ones maybe, because those are the times when I learned how strong we are together." "We made a good life," Garrett said. "We made a wonderful life," Teresa corrected, "and it is not over yet. We have years ahead of us still." She was right. They had another decade together, 10 more years of springs in the mountains and winters in town, of visits with children and grandchildren, of quiet evenings by the fire and summer nights under the stars. Garrett's body gradually failed him, his strength diminishing year by year until he could no longer make the trip to the cabin without help. Teresa's health remained more robust, but she slowed too, content to spend her days reading and visiting with family rather than working constantly as she had for so many years. Garrett died peacefully in his sleep in February of 1935, 2 months short of his 80th birthday. Teresa found him in the morning, still and cold, his face peaceful. She sat with him for a long time, holding his hand and remembering the first time she had seen him, this mountain of a man who had looked at her with such gentleness. She thought about the wagon ride to the valley, about his proposal in the snow, about 48 years of marriage that had been everything she could have hoped for and more. Thank you, she whispered to him, though she knew he could not hear. Thank you for seeing me when I was lost. Thank you for showing me the valley. Thank you for loving me so well. Teresa lived another 8 years without him, staying in the house in Jordan Valley and spending her time with her extensive family. She never returned to the cabin in the mountains, could not bear to see it without Garrett there, to fill it with his presence. But she often asked her children to drive her to the valley overlook, where she would sit for hours looking at the view and remembering. She died in her sleep in November of 1943, at the age of 87, surrounded by children and grandchildren who had gathered to celebrate Thanksgiving. They found her in the morning with a smile on her face, and every one of them knew she had gone to find Garrett, wherever he was waiting for her. They buried her next to him in the Jordan Valley Cemetery, under a stone that read, Teresa Logan Dalton, beloved wife, mother, and friend. At the funeral, Grace stood up to speak about her mother, and she chose to tell the story that every one of them had heard 100 times but never tired of hearing. My mother came to Jordan Valley alone and frightened, with nothing but $43 in hope, Grace said, her voice strong despite her tears. My father saw her and decided to help, not because he wanted anything from her, but because it was the right thing to do. He took her in his wagon and drove her miles into the mountains just to show her the valley views, to help her understand that the world was bigger and more beautiful than she had imagined. And in doing so, he gave her not just a journey, but a whole new life. They built something together that lasted nearly half a century, something that created all of us and shaped all of our lives. That is the legacy they leave us. Not wealth or position or fame, but love. Simple, enduring, transformative love. The funeral ended, and the family dispersed to their various homes and lives. But they carried with them the story of the mountain man and the city girl who had found each other in a frontier town and built an extraordinary life together. They told it to their children, who told it to their children, passing down not just the facts, but the lesson at the heart of it all. Sometimes love comes when you least expect it, in the form of a stranger who sees you when you feel invisible. Sometimes it grows slowly, built on kindness and respect and shared experiences. Sometimes it requires courage, requires leaving behind everything familiar to embrace something unknown. But when you find it, when you recognize it and have the bravery to reach for it, it can transform your entire life. That was the gift Garrett and Teresa gave each other that day in Jordan Valley, Oregon in 1878. And it was the gift they passed down through generations, a reminder that love, real love, is always worth the risk.